Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Top Talk Guest Photographer webinar with George Fairbairn. Hi, George. I believe I have you in the wings there, waiting patiently.
Yep, I'm here.
Good evening to you, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
But firstly, just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into photography, and how the journey to where you are today has kind of happened, really.
Okay. Well, for anybody that's surprised by my accent, I am American, although I do now refer to myself as English with an American accent, because I've lived here since 1998 or something around there. My journey to where I'm at now is a very weird journey because I was very much into photography in what we term high school in the States. So much so that I'd been offered a scholarship to the University of Seattle, but I lived in Chicago at that time, and being a weird teenager, I didn't want to move away from home, so I turned it down, and then 2 years later I was stationed in England in the U.S. Air Force. So I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I spent a good 8 years in the military and never picked up a camera at all during those 8 years. And it wasn't until I got out of the military and kind of started picking up a camera a bit again and just started taking pictures of bands local to me, and it just kind of snowballed from there, and now this is what I do.
Well, that can't be bad. So actually, we never discussed this before. So the bands sort of came before sort of the advertising portraiture?
Yeah, oh yeah. Bands is what I started out doing, and I started out doing live stuff, which I don't really do anymore at all. But it was kind of the thing that opened the door for me to get into the work that I do. And it's one of the things I'll talk about when I start showing my pictures, how it, well, although it's going in reverse order, how it kind of evolved into incorporating commercial stuff into it as well.
You can see on the screen, and I will post these out. These are the best ways to interact with you, isn't it, George? Your Facebook, your Twitter, and your Instagram is what they're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I'm very active on all of those. Facebook, probably not as much as the other ones, but Twitter, you might end up unfollowing me with the amount I tweet, but...
Excellent. And at the moment, obviously, I'd just like to add that George does do quite a bit of training for himself. He doesn't have anything in the pipeline. Well, he's got some plans, and they're the best ways to find out what's going on, isn't it? So obviously, we'd be telling you about anything that George had going at the moment, but these are the best places to find out what you've got going on for yourself, isn't it, George?
Yeah, I'll always post it up whenever I get things confirmed.
Perfect. Then I shall pass you the screen, and I shall tell you when we can see it.
Figured I'd start with the hardest image I've ever had to create. It was for a London kids adventure playground where they have two locations, and they wanted some advertising photos for both locations. There was a brief specifically for this image because this is like a walkway that they can use in the Romford location where the kids are about 10 to 15 meters up in the air. Once hearing a brief and everything like that, I quickly determined that the best way to do this shoot was going to be as composites. And that's because if we tried to shoot anything on location, we'd either have to do it out of hours, which is a bit of a pain for any of the workers and everybody, the staff at the locations to have to be there for us to take some photos, or we'd have to massively disrupt the areas in order to do the photos. So I took 2 days to photograph each location, and then we took 1 day in the studio to shoot the kids in the studio, and then we composited them together. The reason why this image was so hard is, A, I had to shoot that background from about 10 to 15 meters up in the air, perched on some very rickety scaffolding. And to make matters worse, I had my tripod with me as well because I'm very particular when I shoot for composites that everything is exactly the same. And so that came into play when I photographed the children. I had to place them, as you can see, the kid with the eye on the end, that kid had to be on the left side of my frame when I was photographing her. And then the kid with the E all the way at the end, she had to be on the right side of my frame when I was photographing her. Because I shot the background image on a very wide lens, this wouldn't allow for that perspective to match when I had to photograph. And then the lighting and everything like that, I had to ensure that it matched. But yeah, so this image consists of, I don't even know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, probably 12 different images. And it was the hardest thing I've ever had to create. But it was worth it. It won me Advertising Photographer of the Year last year with the societies. And the client was over the moon with the photo. So I'll show you another one from this shoot. This is probably, even though that image was the hardest one I've done and the most, one with the most, gave me the most gratification out of doing it, this is probably my favorite image from the entire shoot. And it's because this kid was brilliant at acting out the emotions I wanted her to portray. So at this location, again, they have this ball pit area that dumps balls onto the kids. They can fill up that drum you can see behind her with balls, and they get sucked up to this thing, and then the kids hit a button and the balls come dumping down. And again, being as I knew I was shooting all of this stuff as composites, shooting this was quite difficult actually, because I had to use a slower shutter speed, and I had to really drag the shutter because I didn't want the balls frozen in the air. I wanted you to be able to see the movement on it. So I didn't use any flash when I photographed the background, so that was easy because then I just put it on the slower shutter speed. I think I used about 1/10 of a second on this shot to get that motion blur with the balls falling on her. And then to sort of replicate that in the studio was much trickier. I don't know how when you photograph something with flash, it's going to freeze it. And even if you put it on rear curtain sync, which is what I did, which is where the flash will fire at the end of the shutter length, if nothing's been illuminating the balls before the flash goes off, they're still going to look frozen. So for the first time ever, I used the modeling lights on my lights, and I never use the modeling lights. I don't really have an answer as to why I don't. But for this one I did, and I cranked them way up so that when we dumped the balls, there was some light from the modeling lights illuminating the balls, so that when my flash went off at the end of my shutter time, there was a little bit of motion blur. And so it looks like the balls are falling on her. And then putting this one together was actually quite straightforward. Beyond that, just shooting the technical bits of it was what was harder for it.
Well, we've chatted about it. A few people have sort of come through the concepts behind these images, because we're seeing a series now that obviously from the same sort of for the same client and shoot. Is these ideas, are they primarily yours? Discussions with the clients, something they've brought to you? What's the sort of process in that, mate?
Yeah. So for things like this. For these ones where these first three are all the same client, and then the next three are all going to be the same client as well. But for this one in particular, the one image he came to me with on the brief was that first one. And it wasn't exactly how it ended up being, but his idea was he definitely wanted to use the walkway above the play area with kids wearing those T-shirts that spelled out "I love Kid Space." From there, it was a matter of me kind of coming up with what would be the best composition, what would be the best way to do the photo, and everything like that. The rest of it, the brief, was more along the lines of, we want photos that will include the ball dump area, that will include the laser tag area, that will, show that, kids can have fun, or show that, it's cool for kids to go, which is the photo you're seeing right now, which was where I fulfilled that part of the brief. But the ball one was one of those where he said he wanted something to utilize the ball area. And for me, one of the things I always say to my models specifically when I'm photographing them is to exaggerate things, because if you exaggerate things in photos, it will feel cheesy, and it might even look cheesy at the time. But when the photo's done, it looks more epic, for lack of a better word. Because if things were a bit more static, it doesn't have that same sort of impact, and that's why I wanted like that motion blur on the balls in that previous image, because it added more impact to the photo. So for that one, it was kind of, I know I'm going off tangent here. It was kind of the idea of just taking his initial brief, which was the bridges, and then he wanted Kid Space to be portrayed as a cool, fun place for kids of all ages. That I then kind of created the rest of them. This photo that you're seeing now was specifically designed to show that Kid Space is cool for kids of all ages. That's why we've got slightly older kids in this photo. I did a very band pose with them, so I took upon my band photography and like put it into this, putting them back to back, arms crossed, chests out, making them look strong and proud and happy. And then I shot them from what I call the Superman angle as well, which is where you're shooting very low and you're shooting up on them, and it kind of adds more drama and more heroic feel to it, for lack of a better word. And that's the whole concept of this one that you're looking at. Was we wanted it to be heroic and confident and cool. And I always have to make sure, and you'll see it a lot in my photos, that there's a lot of empty space in my photos. And that's because of the nature of the work that I do, that it's become very habitual to leave space for people to put logos and texts and things like that. And so a lot of the times my photos, sometimes the subjects are rather small, so I have to play on that, making it have more impact with a rather small subject matter in the photo, if that makes sense. Because without all the logos and text on it, it would look a bit more boring if it wasn't so dramatic. Not sure if I really answered the question without going off on a tangent too much, but yeah.
No, I think you did, pal. But we've had a few more questions quickly come through. So, yeah. How are you matching the lighting then with your composites? Is there a key? Is there a formula for that?
That's a tricky one. So for this, I can answer fairly straightforward for this composite. This composite, since I was using many different backgrounds for what was essentially going to be the same models in the studio, I did a cheating sort of light setup, which is one light as your key light to light them, and then two lights either side behind at 45 degrees, and you can kind of fit them into any lighting scenario when you do that. I call it a cheat because it is a cheat. It doesn't, well, it's the cheating way to work, because then you can put the subjects into any location at all. You'll see in the next, so the previous one I used 3 lights because they were going to be very generic. In this one, I had very specific backgrounds in mind for each and every photo that I was taking of the models in the studio. I made my lights match those instances. So for here, it's still technically a 3-light setup, but the difference is that I was using what normally would be the key light as just a fill light. My key light is actually the light that would have been camera left and then slightly behind him, and you can see it's giving him a Rembrandt lighting pattern on his face, and that is my key light, and then I just had to fill the shadows. So I had already had this background photographed, and I knew where my light source was in the background when I photographed it, so I placed my lights to match that. That's really the simple answer to that question, is know where your light source is coming from in your backgrounds, and then place your lights to match that on the subjects that you're photographing. Before we move on really quick, I'll tell you a little bit about this shoot. So this is a shoot for a headphones company. Some people have heard of them, some people have not. They're in the same vein as Skull Candy headphones, but they're called Urbans. I've been doing their yearly sort of advertising shots for the last 4 or 5 years, I think. And this is the first year that we did theirs as composites. And again, it was because of, it was for ease, really. They had about 5 different ranges of headphones. They were sports headphones were the key feature that they wanted to do, but they wanted the models to be in a variety of sports situations. So running, gyms, yoga, things of that nature. In order to trudge models around to all these different locations would have taken a few days. It would have cost them a lot more money. I would have charged them a lot more. And I'm not a money grabber, so I always try to make it the easiest way for them, even though it paid me less, was to do it as composites. So we spent one day in the studio, and then I went out and photographed the backgrounds beforehand to fit them into. So this is another one where I used sort of the cheap light setup. And the reason for that is this background actually didn't have a light source in it. I added that sun to it later. But on the day that I took this, there just was no sun, as you can see from the sky. So normally I try to, when I shoot the backgrounds for composites, I try to make sure that there's a light source in my photo, like that previous one, so that when I photograph the models, I have a very specific light source that I can match my lighting to. So for this one, I knew she was going to go onto this scene, I knew I didn't have a light source and I was going to add one, so I used my cheating light setup of 3 lights so that she would fit into it. And again, the main point of these photos were to show these models as sort of everyday fitness buffs that would use the sports headphones for their workouts. So trying to make the headphones the key of the photos was very crucial. The last one, you could see it was very clear. He had his head turned to the side. You can see the headphones. This one is not quite so clear, but and to get by that, we've made sure we've got the string hanging down in front of her. It's very obvious she's wearing headphones, and then with a logo and everything, you would know the brand. But it's key for when you're doing commercial and advertising stuff is never forget that the product you're selling should be the focus of the photos. So in this one, it becomes much more apparent that the headphones are the key feature in this photo. Again, this is one where I've gone back to using really the 2 lights. I've got the 1 light that would have been camera left and behind her, giving her split lighting, and then I've used my, what was formerly my key light, as just a fill light to make it a bit less dramatic, so that the headphones were illuminated, because if I didn't do that, the headphones would have been in shadow, and that defeats the whole point of the shoot. And then I add 1 more rim light off to the camera right and behind her, and that's just really to give it some separation from the background and to kind of spice things up a bit. Again, with this one, though, I added that sunlight coming there, and because it was such an overcast day, there's no real light direction in the background, so it's not evident that I've added, I mean, it might be, but it's not clearly evident as, you know, if the shadows were from a sun that was behind me in the photo and then I've added a sun in the photo behind me, it would look instantly fake. But because it was so overcast and so dreary, there was no real light direction in the photo, so I can get away with faking the sun there. And then it only accentuated when you see that really nice split lighting on her. It kind of ties that together that, yes, that sunlight is affecting her face. That makes sense. And that's really key to making a composite work, is the lighting and then the perspective and height. The heights that you take pictures from have to match. They have to be the same. I have 3 sort of settings on my tripod that I take my background photos from, and I call them my full length, my half body, and then my head and shoulders. And those are, for when I photograph the models, those are the heights that I typically photograph. And then I have those options to say, right, I've got this full body shot, I can put it into this background. But if I try to take a head and shoulder shot and put it into a background that was shot really low, it will look very bad, and people will know instantly that it's a composite. So top tip from me, that's your #1 sort of thing that you need to know to make composites realistic, is that your heights and your perspectives are always the same. So if you shoot up on the person, make sure you shoot up when you shoot your background, and vice versa. Make sure it's always from the same height.
Just wanted to ask, and we mentioned it, and I'm not sure if I misheard. Obviously, we're with the composites as such, and we're talking about the lighting. It's studio flash or speed light, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, so a combination of both, actually. So with the composites, all the ones that you saw there were the models were actually shot in a studio. So those were using studio lights. And I couldn't tell you what, because it's various rented studios for the different shoots. But sometimes when I do composites, they're not shot in a studio. And I have one coming up in the photo after this one, actually, where it's a composite, but I didn't shoot them in a studio because we didn't have a studio. It was shot in a cafe, and I just had a white background up to put behind them. And then it's using right now, for my location lighting, I use Elinchrom Quadras. For a long time, I used speed lights, and I'm still a big. I'll always say equipment doesn't matter, because it really doesn't. I would still honestly be using speed lights if I didn't show up to a shoot for a magazine and the band manager kind of looked at me pulling out my speed lights as if I was not worthy of the job. And even though they were more than happy with the photos, it was ever since that sort of impression that I was leaving using speedlights that I changed to something much more professional looking, even though I firmly believe the equipment doesn't really matter. So saying that, this photo was shot with speedlights. It was one speedlight through a large octabox. This was shot out on location. It was shot in a little pub. It was for a little, I shouldn't say little, because he will be big one day, I think. It was for a little singer-songwriter guy. He has since moved back to the States. But yeah, this photo is kind of epitomizes what I started out doing once I got past the live music thing. I really focused on learning my lighting, and lighting is kind of one of the things I really feel that make my images. So this picture then, it's a shame the magazine's not really around anymore except for online, but Professional Photographer magazine last year had their award ceremony, and this picture got me runner-up in location lighting for the year, which made me quite happy, but I would have preferred to win. But yeah, so sorry, you sound like you're going to ask me something.
No, I wasn't. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead, mate.
Oh no, sorry. So yeah, this is the epitome of what I love doing, and that's shooting something out on location. Honestly, even though like most of my work is well, I'd say it's 50-50 composites and stuff, working on location is what I love doing the most, because I love composing things and finding the best spot to shoot things and finding the right light for that particular location. And in this was a very old grade 2 listed pub. It was very crooked, and the crookedness still to this day though drives me a little bit nuts when I look at this photo, because if you look at the tiles, you can see that this wall was crooked. That chair rail in the back is perfectly straight, but those tiles at the ground are not. And that still drives me nuts. Maybe I'm a bit OCD. I don't know. So this one is a composite, and this is the one I was talking about in the last photo, where in relation to the studio lighting question. So I'll give you a little bit more information on the brief for this shot. So this was shot for a prog metal band called Deadly Circus Fire. They're releasing an album, I think, in about 2 weeks' time, and they wanted a shoot that would kind of sit side by side with the artwork for the album. They already had the artwork for the album. I wasn't shooting the album cover. I was just shooting the images that would be used to promote the album when it came out, and that would fit nicely with the artwork when it came out. So they're a very dark band. They used to be a bit like Slipknot in that they wore masks and makeup and things like that, and they've since done away with that, and they just show themselves as they are. But the music is very dark, and the album cover has got a guy wearing a suit with a hood over his head. One of the photos we did for this shoot, they're all wearing hoods over their heads as well, which directly matches the artwork. But this one, we wanted something that showed their faces. So I wanted more dramatic lighting to make it a bit more dark. And so for this one, I already had the background in mind. This is actually a little running path around the corner from my house that I just applied a lot of Gaussian blur to make it look like it was out of focus. It did have that sun where you see it behind that guy's head. And so I knew that when I was taking the photo, I needed at least one light, camera right, to give them that effect on their face. And then I knew I wanted my key light to be really dramatic. So my key light, it was set up for split light. It was placed directly to the left of them, so it would only illuminate half their face, no more, that's it. No fill light on this. I generally don't tend to use fill light at all, so I didn't have any fill light on this one. And this one, in general, was a quite easy shot to do because I blurred that background so much. The focus is really on the band, and it fits nicely with what they wanted the photo to do. I will say, 'cause I'm sure somebody will ask probably about the cutting out of that beard. The beard, hair is fairly easy. I do some Photoshop YouTubes and stuff, videos that I would talk about that stuff. But that beard was a massive pain. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do until I had a little light bulb moment in my head. And on the mask for cutting him out, I grabbed the grass brush in Photoshop and used that to go around the beard. And if you get it to the right size and you would make it flutter around a little bit, it looks like hair. So it turned out to be quite a good cutout in the end.
I've had a few questions come through about, because we're looking at the band stuff now, but I know this is kind of coming up, so I just wanted to give people a heads up. But a lot of people have been asking about the concepts and the ideas, whether they're yours or the band's, or is it a collaboration. So just to give you the heads up when you're talking about the next few, because I'm privy to what's coming, just the sort of, where it comes from.
Yeah, and it can apply to this one as well. So this one is not a composite. This one was shot on location. The concept and idea behind this photo was quite interesting. And this is one where it was, I should say, I think 90% of the time, the ideas come from, and I hope this doesn't sound really cheesy, but the ideas come from like a little seedling of an idea the band has. They'll be like, oh, like these guys, for example, they're like, oh, we want to do this shoot. They classify themselves as a genre they call post-sadcore, which is a bit emo. And they're like, we want to show that, we're this emo band, really. We want something to do with hearts. That was kind of the entire brief for the shoot. Going into the shoot, I've worked with these guys many times before, so that kind of helped where going into the shoot, I genuinely didn't have any idea what we were going to do until I saw where we were going to shoot. And that's kind of the case a lot of the time, is that unless I already have a very specific idea or I know the place that we're going to shoot at, I don't really know what I'm doing until I see where I'm shooting. And that kind of dictates a lot of what's going to happen. So for photos like this, where there's no real story to the photo, it's just a sort of emotion, a concept, I let the location dictate the shoot. So when I arrived, weirdly enough, even though that is a metal wall that you see behind me, this was a recording studio, which I know that doesn't make any sense. Why a recording studio has a metal wall was absolutely beyond me. But when I saw that metal wall, I said, we need to shoot in front of that, because they were already wearing these black cardigans and the black ties and the white shirts. I said, we need to shoot in front of that because it's going to have a nice contrast between the hard, grunginess of the metal wall and then the sort of innocent black cardigan, black tie wearing guys. And then with the hearts, with the three of them, we said, because a lot of the album was around relationship breakups and things like that. So we played on that and we cut out these three hearts. One not broken, one's broken, and then one sort of haphazardly patched together. And another interesting thing with this is I very much like symmetry in my photos when I can. So even though the guy you see in front, he's not the singer of the band. Normally I always put the singer of the band as sort of the focal point of the shot. But he was head and shoulders taller than the rest of them. And with it being a three-piece band and me having the idea of the composition in my head of what I wanted it to look like, I put him in the middle. Because it made for a better composition. It made a sort of triangle with their heads and then the three hearts all being in a line. So I hope I answered that question as I talked through that photo as well. And then the one after this, I'll talk a lot more about the concepts. But this is another one where the location. Actually, I'm gonna change this one. I'm gonna say this was more their personalities dictated this shot. They're a pop punk band. They're very fun. They're very energetic. They're very goofy. We did a number of shots. This is a weird sort of it's a metal fabrication shop actually. I think it was the bass player's dad's shop. But when we got there, I was like, this place does not fit your music, your personalities. It doesn't really work. But it was the only thing we had. So I said, well, we're going to make it work. We're going to make your personalities have to shine through. And that's where I always say to kind of exaggerate things. And with this one, instead of having them exaggerate things, because they're already pulling pretty ridiculous faces, I was the one that was exaggerating things. So I shot this on a 12 to 24 mil lens. I'm pretty sure it was at 12 millimeters, but this was also shot on a crop sensor lens at the time, so that would have put it at, I don't even know what that is. I can never remember the math for that, 1.5, so about 18, I think. And I was literally probably a foot from him. So by doing that, I was exaggerating their faces, making them look a bit more cartoonish, playing with the lens distortion and adding the lens distortion. So it makes his cheeks look bigger, his chin looks bigger, his nose looks bigger, because that's the closest things to the lens. And then the rest of them, the guy in the middle, he's probably not very affected by the lens distortion at all. And then the guy on the right is going to be more affected by the lens distortion because he's on the edge of the frame. So I played on the pop punk funness with this and tried to make do with the location that I had, because I hated the location when we got there to shoot this, because it just was the opposite of what their music is about.
George, I'm just going to take you back a slide, if I may. Just had a quick question come through, and I thought it better to add it now rather than we go so far ahead. So with these three guys, in general terms, how's the sort of overall effect on the skin tone achieved? Or just a quick pointers on that for us.
Okay. Trying to figure out a way to explain it quick, I guess. Post-processing wise, on a lot of these photos is actually a lot less than what you think. There's probably one step within my post-processing that gives it that look. But for this one, with the skin tones, this was shot probably, I want to say about 2 years ago now, but it's still one of my favorite photos. But this would have been shot before my current skin smoothing technique, which is a thing called high frequency separation. This was done before that, or before I learned that, I should say. So this would have been done in Nik Color Efex 4, if anybody's familiar with that. In Nik software Color Efex 4, they have a thing called the dynamic skin smoother, I think is what it's called. It does quite a good job. It's quite easy to use, and to be honest, that's how I did the skin on this one. So I don't have any magic trick besides I used the plugin. Now I use high frequency separation, frequency separation. Sorry, I keep saying high. It's just frequency separation. This one I'm hoping to kind of talk a bit more about the ideas. So this image is a perfect example of the band had, again, I'm going to say a seedling of an idea, and I just expanded it and made it into something grander, without sounding pretentious. But their idea was that they wanted some sort of, they didn't know how they wanted it done, but they wanted to show that they were captured and that they were going to be set on fire. But they wanted it to also kind of show their personalities as well. And again, I was fortunate in that this is another band I'd worked with at this point 2 times before this shoot, so I knew their personalities, and I instantly had their roles figured out in my head. But I just had to figure out how I wanted to fit those roles into the photo. So knowing their personality, the guy pouring the petrol, he's very much the sort of prankster, troublemaker guy of the band. He's always doing stuff to them, whether it be knocking them over, lighting them on fire, which he did do once, things of that nature. The guy smoking the cigar, that is him. He's the most laid-back person I've ever met in my life. And then the guy in the middle is, again, he's a bit of a girl, to be honest. He screams about everything, and he's the singer. So anyways, I knew their personalities, and I knew I needed to fit all these personalities into the photo, and I sort of just came up with this idea based around their sort of seedling of they wanted something where they were going to be set on fire. I didn't want to really set them on fire, so I came up with the next best thing, which was they're about to be set on fire. And then this is another perfect example where you need to exaggerate things to make it work. Particularly the guy pouring the petrol. I had to have him do this shot a couple of times, and I had to keep saying, bend your back more, lift it up higher, really scream, because if he's just standing there, just pouring it, you know, with like a sort of half scream, it loses all the impact that it can have by having him really exaggerate it and bend his back up and lift that up and genuinely scream while he's doing it. And then the same with the guy. I know this is going to sound backwards, but the guy on the left, I had to have him sort of exaggerate being casual, which really sounds like an oxymoron, but I had to have him sort of exaggerate it, because he looked more bored than casual the first couple of times. So that's, you know, I had him purse the lips like he's got there, hold it out a little bit, you know, a lot of posing went into it, of curling the fingers and things like that. But all those little details help make the finished picture have more impact. And this is not a composite. This was shot as you see it. I say the keys to this were getting those sort of poses and everything correct. And we did those before we poured the water, because this was shot in February. It was very cold outside. And then the other key thing I had to make sure as well is that we could see that light or see that water and see that smoke. And the best way to illuminate water and illuminate smoke is from behind. So I've got a light either side of them behind, one for the smoke, one for the water. And again, that was something that if you didn't do, it would lose the impact that smoke would. If it was only the light in the front, you would still see it, but it wouldn't be as prominent as it is. And the water, you very well might have just lost in the blackness if you didn't have that backlight on there. So this is a much more recent, this is very, very recent photo. This is, again, shot on location. The idea behind this one was that they're a metal band, but they wanted a shoot that wasn't your standard cliche metal band photo, you know, standing in an alleyway or standing on train tracks and standing in front of a full moon, which I know is cliche, and I have photos I've done of that, of other bands, but they wanted something that was totally different. It might sound a little bit cheesy, but I kind of played off their name in order to get this location idea, and their name is, they're called the Manic Shine, and I said, ooh, shine. I'm like, you know, I've never done a shoot in a laundromat. Let's do a shoot in a laundromat. And that's legitimately where this idea came from. Their poses and everything is, again, with bands, it's really easy because they're used to performing, so they're usually not afraid to let their personalities out. And this one very, very clearly shows each of their personalities. The guy on the left, he's the very quirky one. He's constantly pulling faces like that. The guy in the middle, he always looks grumpy. He's not a grumpy guy, but he just has that, you know, look. And he looks like Hitman. If anybody's ever played that game, Hitman, he looks like him. And then, you know, the guy on the right is another very laid-back guy. So we try to make sure we got their personalities in the shot. The hardest thing with this photo was the location, because it was rather narrow. So I was a bit closer to them than I wanted to kind of, I didn't want any lens distortion. And I couldn't place my light where I wanted it. Normally when I shoot a band, I light very much dead center, so that if it's a 5-person band, for example, the guy in the middle will have butterfly lighting, and then as you go out from the guy in the middle, the light tapers off into loop and Rembrandt and things of that nature. Because of the location, I could not put my light in front of me, so I had to put it off to the side. And my light, I had to mess with it quite a bit to get what I wanted. So I got good lighting on all of them. And as you go across from left to right, you've got almost butterfly lighting on the guy on the left, and then it kind of goes down into Rembrandt to the guy on the right. And I'm very particular about my lighting, so it took me a long time to kind of get this lighting right for this photo. And then to not worry about getting reflections off of the washing machines behind, because that glass is very reflective. The washing machines were metal, they're very reflective. So I had to make sure the angle of my light wasn't going to reflect off of them as well, and then illuminate them from behind, because I did not want that. So the last 3 images here are not bands and not advertising. And I kind of snuck these in because I feel it's an almost more important part of being a photographer. These are personal project shots. I get more work from my personal projects than I do from any commission that I've done. Personal projects are essential. I think they challenge you creatively, they push you, they motivate you, and like I said, they get you work. I get more work from personal things that I shoot than anything else. So this image I wanted to share because it was one of the harder ones I've done in this style that I've done, but it's not a style that I haven't done before this image. So this image is both a composite and shot exactly where you see it. It's something that's called a single space composite, and basically everything you see in this photo legitimately happened exactly where you see it, just not at the same time. So doing these are dead easy. I might do some workshops or YouTube videos or something on these sometime in the future, but they're very easy and they're very good ways to get what I like to say is the perfect picture. Everything in this picture is perfect. It's exactly how I wanted it to be. And the idea behind this photo was I wanted to create sort of a modern day take on the Last Supper. Even though I'm not very religious, I wanted it a modern sort of version of what the Last Supper would look like nowadays. So I found a rather large family. I wanted each of their personalities to come through. I wanted it laid out in a way that, you know, was representational of the Last Supper. And I just went with it. And, you know, I let each of their personalities sort of dictate what the overall photo was going to be. So, you know, you've got on the left side, that's a husband and wife. He works for the Bank of England, so he's constantly got his nose buried in some economics report. And she, I forget what she does, but she's always on her BlackBerry, so they're doing their fighting thing. And everybody's got their stories going on. Like I said, I've gotten a lot of work just from this photo being in my portfolio. So this is my son. And again, personal shot, but it gets you work, because I think your personal work is for you. It's where you get a chance to create what you want to create. And so I had this picture in my head for a very long time with my son, but he recently has taken to wanting to take showers instead of baths. So it took me a little bit of time to actually get him to do this photo. But this is one where I don't smooth skin on children or babies very often, but I did with my son on this one. And this is one where I did use high frequency separation to smooth his skin out and kind of get rid of the little inconsistencies in skin tone. Because he was in the bath, there was a lot of inconsistencies in skin tone because some of it was hot from the water, some of it cooled off from not being in the water and things like that. So I had to do some skin smoothing on him. But this was just shot as you see it. There's no fancy Photoshop work in this one at all, and it's again gotten me, you know, quite a bit of work just from my son being my son, really. This is another one of my son. It's another one where originally it was a totally different idea. Well, not totally different. The teddy bear was going to be replaced with a vegetable monster. And the idea was I wanted the photo to be make friends with your vegetables. Making a sort of monster out of vegetables proved much harder than I anticipated. So I substituted my son's favorite teddy for the photo, and I supersized him basically. So my son was shot exactly where you see him, doing exactly what you see him do, but there was just nobody sitting in that chair. And then I photographed his teddy on a white background, blew him up, and plopped him into the seat, and then you have this photo here. And again, I really like photos that tell a story. And so, you know, what kid doesn't want to have tea with their toys? That was kind of my thinking once I ditched the vegetable monster idea. And exaggeration again. If you look at my son's face in here, he's pouring tea, but he's concentrating on pouring that tea. Because he's really stretched out. I wanted everything to be exaggerated. So he's stretching out across the table so he can pour the tea. He's got his tongue out from concentration. And it just makes for a better composition and a more impact in the photo. And then the last photo is the next one. This was a couple photos earlier. I'd mentioned that single space composites. This was the very first photo I ever did that on. And it was what became my most popular photo, and it still probably is one of them. If most people know me for whatever reason, it's probably because of this photo. And this was one of those where it was shot for our family Christmas cards. I wanted to do something funny, something a bit different for the family, Christmas cards, really. So my son he's doing what he does. That was my son at that age, and well, still running around, jumping, being crazy, being a kid. And then I wanted the rest of it to be a little bit more retro and vintage. So those really aren't much of our personalities. They're kind of more just the idea I had in my head. I wanted like a 1950s, dad reading a newspaper, the housewife, pouring the tea. But again, exaggerating everything. So she's pouring the tea from a stupidly high height. I had to make sure that when I shot this, that the newspaper wasn't covering up any of my face, and I was just kind of holding the cup out. And then my son, it was just one shot. That was the first shot of him, and he was done. And then I put it together, and that was it. It kind of started a whole lot. This photo really started a lot for me, because it got me going down a path of telling stories and putting some comedy into my photos, and then utilizing that single-space composites technique, because it's something I use all the time now, because it allows me to make sure each element of the photo is perfect, and then you get a perfect photo at the end of it. I think that's it for me rambling now. I very much would like to answer questions if people have questions.
We do indeed. Getting started then, let's go right back to the beginning. Obviously, you talked about you started out with live music, and a few questions came through right at the beginning. How do you get started? How do you really get permission to shoot live bands? I could have answered this, because that it's something that I do, but I wanted to come from you, really, mate. So I'll chip in if there's anything I can think of. But so just with the live stuff, how do you get going?
Okay, well, my starting out with live stuff was not glamorous, so I'll put that out there. So getting permission and doing everything that I did starting out with was really simple, and that was just showing up at the live music pubs in Cambridge and taking pictures. And then from there, you take pictures of the band, you start talking to them afterwards, you give them a card, you say, hey, I took some photos. Let me know if you want any other pictures done, and blah, 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 and then things kind of snowball from there. I wish I had a bit more experience in the live music stuff, because I can't really answer that question beyond that. I think I would know the ways, and that would be to contact whatever promoters putting on the show and getting permission from them, or finding a magazine or a blog or somebody that has the connections and saying you'll do the shoot for them. And then you can get into shows that way.
From my experience, sorry, George, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, from my experience as a live music photographer, and I still do it, it is exactly what you just said. I mean, it's very difficult now, especially with the larger venues. A lot of doors are closed, so you do need to either get in with the promoters, which is difficult. But starting out, my advice to you now, and I think George would agree, go to the smaller venues. That's what I did. Go to the smaller venues. Some of them will take you on just as a venue photographer, and then the bands will get to know you, and they'll want you to shoot them. Magazines, blogs, internet. I, for one, actually started, along with a friend of mine, a music review website. This was 7 years ago now, well, actually 10 years ago now, and it ran for 3 years, and then we just got too busy to do it. But it did work. My friend was writing the reviews, and I shot the images. But we did do that solidly for 3 years, and then I said a lot of the bigger boys and the big companies sort of closed some doors. So start small, George. I think you'll agree. Go at the smaller venues, go for the local bands, those sort of things. Contact them; they'll be happy to do it. Just do it for time, do it for images, just to build up your experience, because it's not the easiest thing to shoot in the world either, is it, mate?
No, it's one of the hardest things. I did that. I did the pubs, and then from there, I would give them cards, and I would do promo photos for them, and those were far better than the live stuff I was taking. And so I kind of ditched the live stuff fairly early on, once I started building a name in Cambridge for photographing promo shots of bands. So yeah.
So are you so let's get onto that then, because a few people were saying how to get into that side of it then. So are you advertising yourself as a photographer for the bands, or are you going to their agencies, to their management? What's the best way to sort of get these things off the ground then, bud?
That's a tricky one as well. So nowadays, I kind of market myself here. I do still market myself at bands, and that's partly only because I still really like to help out small bands. So I do take on shoots from smaller bands. They can come to me and ask me to do a shoot. I charge them a smaller amount than what I charge other people because they're smaller band. The exposure and use of the photos isn't as much. But beyond that, I kind of market myself more towards the magazines and then the band's management and the labels. And that's a long way off of where I started from. I mean, when I started out, it was shooting small, unknown bands. At the very beginning, it was doing it for free, purely to get stuff in my portfolio and build up a name. And then it got to the point where people were wanting to pay me to do it, so I started doing that. And then a lot of legwork from there of getting into the point where I am now of shooting for magazines and doing shoots for labels and for management companies. But now that's where that's where my target is in terms of marketing myself. It is almost purely at magazines and labels.
Brilliant. And yeah, no, you've nailed that. And like I said, there's no easy fixes there, mate. It is hard work, it's graft, and it's plodding on, isn't it? And just.
Oh, that's one thing. Don't get discouraged by. I would say don't get discouraged by no, but that's actually not correct. Don't get discouraged by waiting, because that's much harder to take than no. I first met with Rock Sound magazine nearly 3 years ago. I did my first shoot for them nearly 2 years after my first meeting with them, and I just shot my first cover for them 2 weeks ago. So it's taken me 3 years of waiting, essentially, to start getting a good, consistent work out of them. And that's harder to deal with than if they just tell you, no, you're rubbish. Because I went and saw NME, and she looked at my work, and she's like, it's awesome, but it's not NME. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll move on. But you go see Rock Sound, they're like, we love it, we'll be in touch, and you just wait, and you just keep contacting them and keep emailing them and keep going and showing them your portfolio, and just having to wait is much harder to deal with, but it's worth it.
Brilliant, and it is, isn't it? I mean, it's an industry that is getting tougher. The whole photography industry, there's more and more people out there, so you really got to work at it. And if you have a passion for it, I truly believe that, and you're good at it as well. Good things will happen. And but it was, like I said, start at the beginning. Definitely, it's going to take a lot of work. The smaller bands, they won't have any money to start with, but build up your portfolio, like George said, definitely. And obviously, hopefully one day you'll be doing what he's doing. But after he's happily retired and earned a lot of money, obviously. So we've had a couple of quick questions going back now to the composites and sort of the commercial side of things. And a gentleman did join us a bit late, so he does apologise if we've answered this. I'm not sure we have actually. You've mentioned that you often shoot on a white background. Do you ever use a green screen, or do you have a preferred colour for your cutouts, George?
Yes. So I don't use green and I don't use blue. I use gray. My preferred color is gray, and that's for many reasons. But I'll tell you the reasons why I don't use green and blue first. The reasons why I don't use green and blue first is purely color cast. And if it's not a full body shot, so if it's just waist up, head and shoulders, color cast isn't really an issue. So long as you light the background correctly, you have good distance between it and the background, then color cast isn't a problem. It's when you do full body stuff that color cast is a massive problem on green screens and blue screens, and that's because the light is going to reflect up off them, onto their feet, onto their legs, and it's just a nightmare. So I don't really use, I say white, but I do have a white background, but I just don't light it, so it's gray when it comes into Photoshop, and gray is my preferred color, generally because there's blending modes in Photoshop that will just eliminate gray, and so for trickier cutouts and things like that, I can resort to using tricks like that to get the cutouts. But also because gray, weirdly enough, not many people wear gray. White, if somebody's wearing a lighter colored shirt, or if you're using that 3-light setup where you got 2 lights behind them, it's nearly impossible to cut somebody out from white if you do that. So gray is a good general neutral color that I like to use for the composite shooting.
Brilliant. So staying with the cutout and that sort of side of the questions, do you have a preferred method within Photoshop for cutouts, or do you use any cutout plugins at all?
I don't use any plugins for that. I do just use the quick selection tool, and I won't say haphazard with it. I have my sort of technique down to a fine art with it, so to speak, and I do a very quick, rough selection with it, and then I kind of go in and fine tune it, and then I'll use the refine edge to fix little issues with it. And then when you get to trickier cutouts, there's just always different tips and tricks. Using channels is a very good cutout method, but it's very time-consuming. It's a very long, time-consuming process, but it will give you the best possible cutout you can get. But I've learned other tips and tricks, and that's again why I use gray. So if I can't get a perfect cutout, I can usually still get it right by eliminating the gray within Photoshop by a different blending modes for the layers. And those are, just quickly multiply soft light and overlay. Those three will get rid of gray. 50% gray. You have to make sure it's 50% gray.
Somebody's just asked, does the gray then differ in shade depending on the shot, or is it just a simple gray and you're just using that technique you just mentioned then?
Yeah, well, technically it does vary from shot to shot because it'll all depend on how far my light is from the back of the background, because I don't always stand them in the same spot. So it does always vary, but that's when, if I'm going to use Photoshop to sort of help me get rid of the gray by the blending modes, that's when I'll start tweaking that color of the background itself. And you need to get it to 50% gray to get rid of it using the blending modes. But as a starting point, it does vary from shot to shot. It just depends on where I've posed them, really.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we're almost there. So just the last couple. So obviously we're talking at the moment about the retouching and the post process. Do you do all of your own retouching, George?
I do, yes. I'm too much of a control freak to not. In all honesty, I am. My style is very much dictated upon my lighting and my post-processing. Even though I do, and I know I'm going to say it again, I do a lot less Photoshop than people think. There is one step in my editing that gives my photos my look, and I wouldn't trust somebody else to do that step. So, yeah, I do it myself, and I think I will always do it myself because I'm a control freak, really.
Excellent. I just wanted to add, obviously, from our own experiences here at the Photographer Academy and working as photographers, masking and cutting out, it is an art, and so it does take some work, especially within Photoshop. For one, and I'm not speaking for George, I'm speaking for us now here at the Photographer Academy, and because they are a sponsor, but because we used them before they were a sponsor, the On1 tools is what we use for masking. So if you're finding masking and cutting out difficult, maybe look at the likes of the On1 plugins. I don't know if George is familiar with those or something similar, but there's something that we definitely favour and why we brought them on board, because it's very, very effectively, very, very reasonably priced. But it's all based on removing and adding colours to create your cutouts. But they do seem to have made it easy. But I know Photoshop is getting more easier. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. As like you mentioned, Nick, earlier, tools for the job, just whatever suits you, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, I haven't used any other plugins for cutouts, in all honesty, so I don't have an opinion on that because I haven't tried. But in terms of like other plugins, I am a big fan of. I don't use it as much as I used to, but the Nix bundle now, it's dead cheap. I bought it when it was super expensive. I think I paid 400 quid, and now you can get it for 100. But yeah, it's got bought by Google, and now it's really cheap. And Nick, just NIK. Nix software, and then there's about 4 or 5 different plugins that come with that, and I really like them. Their black and white conversion one, which is called Silver Effects, is brilliant, and then their color effects one is got a couple of tools in it that I use a bit, but not as much as I used to. But other than that, I think it's because of my control freakiness, where I tend to try to stay away from plugins now as much as I can, because if for whatever reason that plugin were to vanish from me, I wouldn't be able to recreate my stuff again. So I've started relying on, which is a bit doomsday scenario actually, but I don't intend it to be. But I want to be able to do it all myself.
Excellent.
Making it sound really OCD.
But you do. You're scaring me now, George. We're friends. Well, a couple of things have come through, and they are sort of things that you and I have discussed off screen or behind the scenes. So somebody's asked whether you'll be running a band shoot training day. Well, it's something that you and I have discussed about filming for the Photographer Academy anyway, isn't it? So
yeah, we're definitely going to do that, which is doing a video for you guys.
But if well, I'm going to speak for George because I'm sure he'll say yes if he can find the time. But if there's enough of you and you're interested, please let me know, and obviously George and I can maybe make this happen, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly what I was about to say.
So, yes. Excellent. And well, so on the same sort of vein, really, somebody was asking about the process, and I know you and I have talked about possibly doing like a Photoshop session, taking a couple of the images and giving some ideas on again how to do the composite. So maybe we can tie that in with the film that we do for the Photographer Academy on the actual shoot, and maybe we do a post-processing film to tie in them with the images, and then they can see the sort of before and after and the stages of that. Yeah. Sounds good to me. And I'll bring the bands, you bring the camera, and we'll get the ideas going. I think, mate, that'll be good.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So yeah, guys, seriously, let us know on that, because if there's enough of you that are interested, you can contact me, Jay, at thephotographeracademy.com, or send George a message via his Facebook or Twitter, and then we'll start sort of getting ideas of numbers around and making try. We'll certainly get off our backsides and try and make that happen sooner rather than later. So George, thank you so much for your time tonight, and thank you guys for staying with us. We haven't run over too badly. I thought we would, but you all stayed with us because it was worth staying with us. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I hope it wasn't too painful.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thank you very much. And thank you guys for coming as well.
Excellent. So once again, thank you all for joining us. George, thank you so much for your time, mate. Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us. Facebook.com/Photographer Academy to keep up to date with us. And we'll see you all again real soon. Good night now.